Selections from Chats on Oriental China by J. F. Blacker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 4. A sketch showing porcelain classed according to the order of the discovery of colors and glazes. Our first task will be to classify the porcelain according to the order of its discovery, and in this relation we shall be largely guided by form and color, which in the oldest pieces is naturally less diversified than in the later. Perhaps the oldest pottery is that improperly called Bokharo, owing to its resemblance to the pottery which, in Portugal, bore this name, and as we shall see presently, the Portuguese were the first to visit the land of far-off Cathay. The colors on Bokharo ware are very varied, and some imitate bronze. Many colored enamels cover other pieces with a dense glaze which completely hides the shape or body. These pieces are usually molded, but examples have been found where the decoration has been cut with a tool in the paste when wet. Other specimens have been carved in the paste after it has been dried in the sun. The second class in order of age would be white porcelain made of kaolins from different districts, which give different tints to the white and unequal densities to the ware, some being heavy and some light. Possibly the light ware of this period gave rise to the idea of soft paste. The white itself varies in tint from a fine creamy glaze, which is very beautiful, called blanc de chine. Then there is a bluish white called white of snow, and a plain white called white of flower. The creamy white is valued very highly by the Chinese themselves, and Franks mentions an instance where a Hong Kong merchant, after making many magnificent presents to an English gentleman, gave him as an object of great value a white cup of this kind enclosed in a case lined with silk. This blanc de chine was highly esteemed in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially in France and Spain. It is interesting to notice that this kind of whiteware was imitated by the early makers of European porcelain at St. Cloud and Chelsea, and many of these specimens of white hard paste have been ascribed to Plymouth, which, with Bristol, was the only factory to make hard paste in England. The Chelsea imitation of an Oriental teapot with raised flowers is the one which has the noted mark of the raised anchor on a tablet. With regard to color applied under the glaze, blue was the first to be so employed. Cobalt had a facility for cohering with the body itself, therefore it was utilized for decoration before the glaze was applied. Sometimes the transparent white glaze was replaced by a blue tinted glaze. In that case the blue decoration, applied under the glaze by painting on the body of the ware itself, could be easily seen through the blue glaze. Red, derived from copper, was applied under the glaze, sometimes alone and sometimes with blue, forming the decoration of two colors under the glaze. With these colors used under the glaze, as with the blue alone, the blue tinted glaze was frequently substituted for the transparent glaze. This red was the red derived from copper. At about the same period the reds, derived from iron and gold, were applied as enamel colors upon the glaze, at a lower temperature than that used in the main kiln. The second kiln was called a muffle kiln. The glaze and the enamel colors were both melted by the heat in the muffle kiln, but the body was not affected. Direct heat was not required, but the melting process was sufficient to unite the glaze itself and the enamel colors so firmly that in some cases the colored enamel might be taken for the glaze. Generally, however, these enamel colors project far enough from the covering glaze so as to be easily felt by the finger. Next followed the use of gold applied to decorations on the black, famille noire, and green families, or on other enamels. Amongst the most beautiful of these enamels was the green, which was applied upon the glaze by the fire of the muffle furnace. This color was derived from copper, and is called vert de cuivre. It soon held a high place in the scheme of decoration of vases, plates, and dishes, as well as figures of the highest quality, and is recognized as a distinct family, la famille verte. But whilst the reds and greens were enameled on the glaze, blue was still employed for decoration under the glaze. These familles are separately dealt with and illustrated. In order of the discovery of the colors, next comes violet, from manganese, and the yellows from cadmium and iron, creating a new series, which is termed the yellow family, La famille jaune. All these yellows were enamel colors, but they were not often used alone. Sometimes there is a combination of two groups, as green and yellow or green and red. These have been classified as jaune vert and rose vert. We simply refer to these names in case any of our readers should come across them in the descriptive catalogue or in books dealing with Oriental porcelain. Perhaps the most beautiful of all the enamel colors applied to Oriental porcelain is the rose, a red derived from gold. Bearing in mind that we are roughly tracing the age of the colors, that is, the period of their applications, this rose red would bring us to the Yongqing and Qianlong periods. Enriched as the Chinese potters were by this superb tint, they simply revelled in dominating their productions with it. It is classified as the rose family, La famille rose. To these periods belong the beautiful class of pink back plates, to which further reference will be made later. Onward from this time, the trading relations between Europe and China becoming more and more intimate, foreign influences began to make themselves felt in the Chinese potteries. In fact, the Europeans demanded and paid for European shapes and European designs, so that European subjects were produced with more or less fidelity, and armorial porcelain, on which arms or crests of European families were painted in enamel, on vases, table services, and decorative pieces of various kinds. At this period, too, we find evidences of the influence of the Christian missionaries in China, as shown by the religious subjects enamelled or painted on plates, such subjects, for instance, as the Crucifixion and other scenes of biblical history. We have stated that the decoration was modified to meet the wants of the European market, and we note also that the various shapes were also modified to suit that market. The Chinese used saucer-shaped dishes, but these were largely replaced, for exportation only, by dishes and plates with rims, so that we finally reach the last class, the porcelain called East India Company China, decorated with subjects not armorial, nor scriptural, but European. The Chinese themselves were faithful copyists, imitating exactly the pattern from which they had to work. We shall deal with this subject more fully in a later chapter. Chapter 6. A short account of the early history of porcelain. Perhaps what we have said will inspire our readers with the desire to know something of the origin of the potter's art in China. This cannot be definitely fixed. It is lost in antiquity. Far back, centuries before the Christian era, possibly when Egyptian civilization was at its height, legendary history refers to the invention of pottery and, indeed, places the invention of pottery thousands of years B.C. We have no definite information as to what was made, but we may fairly assume that in those remote times the vessels made were only coarse clay, rude in form, sun-dried or badly baked in an open fire. Then, possibly, the first efforts at glazing were produced and ornamented, the surface was decorated by drawings with a stick in transverse scratches or concentric rings, and simple bits of clay stuck on to the soft surface formed the first applied ornament, gradually developing, and ever far in advance of Western barbarism. The manufacture reaches the period where actual records were available during the Wei Dynasty, 220 A.D., when 2 potteries were recorded as making porcelain for imperial use. The string of dynasties which follows have but slight interest for the collector. The marks we give (see Marks) range from the Song Dynasty, 960 A.D., to the Tsing Dynasty, which period came into power in 1644 and continues to the present day. Though we read of porcelain blue as the sky, shining as the looking-glass, thin as paper, giving a sound like a musical stone, we could scarcely hope to find a specimen after the lapse of so many hundred years. Besides, if we did, the piece would be unique, and even the experts would doubt its identity. Still, the tiny fragments of this precious ware are recognized in China, and are so valuable that the Chinese have them mounted as personal ornaments. The first of the dynasties shown in our list has a real claim for consideration, that is, the Song Dynasty, which lasted from 960 to 1279 A.D. The Emperor Qin Zong, who reigned from 954 to 1007 A.D., adopted his title name or Nianhao on coming to the throne, King Ti, and he founded the royal manufactory at Changnanchin, henceforth known as King Ti Chin. This city remained for many centuries the greatest manufactory of Chinese porcelain. Here then we have definite history of a city in the Chinese provinces of Kiangsi, with a present population of 500,000, in which porcelain has been manufactured for centuries, and where the manufacturing is still carried on, although, through wars and insurrections, the work has now and then been suspended for varying periods. There were numerous other factories in 13 other provinces, notably in Honan, which has no less than 13. Historical incidents occur which show that Oriental porcelain was by slow degrees making its way westwards. Saladin (1137 1193), Sultan of Egypt and Syria, who defended Accra for 2 years against the Crusaders, sent 40 pieces of finest porcelain to Nur ed-Din Mahmud, who recovered Syria from the Crusaders. That celebrated Venetian traveler and author, Marco Polo, writing in 1280, described a visit to a Chinese factory, and stated that the porcelain was exported all over the world. The Yuan dynasty (1279 1367) saw the advent of Roman Catholic missionaries and Florentine traders. They came to Peking and Hangchow, and far off Cathay, the land of mystery, romance, and poetry, first to make acquaintance with the Western barbarians. We read of porcelain of this period having been molded, modelled, and painted with flowers. The most noted potter, Peng, was not famous for his own individual work of designing new forms or inventing new colors, but for copying the older wares, and we shall never have an opportunity of seeing his work, which, though beautiful, was very thin and brittle. Chapter 7. The Ming Dynasty, 1368 1644, and its products. The story of the overthrow of the Mongol dynasty by a rebellion headed by a native named Hung Wu, the son of a laboring man, introduces the great Ming dynasty. This man, a former Buddhist priest, captured Nanking in 1355, and 13 years later he took the title of emperor. During this dynasty, which lasted till 1644, the progress of the manufacture of porcelain was very marked. Indeed, the Chinese themselves are keen collectors of the Ming products, considering them to be the finest ever made. They scarcely exist outside the treasures of the cabinet of princes or the collections of mandarins. Whether this is due to the extreme devotion of the nation to past history and to their love of ancient relics more than their appreciation of what we consider beautiful, the fact remains, in the early times, Ming porcelain was rarely exported, so that we have very little to guide us in determining what is or is not porcelain of the Ming period. True, there are the marks, but the marks were copied just as much as the forms and decorations were. The best periods of Ming porcelain arranged in order of merit and not in order of date were Suen Ti (1426 1436), Qinghua (1465 1488), Yung Lo (1403 1425), Hietzing (1522 1567). Qinghua is the first in order of reproduction. His mark is most frequently copied. About the period of Qinghua, Europeans were making efforts to reach the East by sea, and in 1498 Vasco da Gama sailed round the Cape of Good Hope and thus made an opening, by which eventually trade was carried on by sea to China. The Portuguese were the first to settle in China in 1516. From their factory or settlement in Macao, at the entrance to the Canton River, the first sea-borne pieces of Oriental porcelain were sent to Europe by way of the Cape. The conclusion, therefore, must be, in view of these dates, that the earliest pieces found in England and on the Continent were carried overland, by camels, thousands of miles over mountains and through deserts, till at last they reached their European owners. The earliest porcelain found in England, that is, a Celadon bowl presented to New College, Oxford, by Archbishop Warham, and the bowls of Oriental china given in 1506 by Philip of Austria to Sir Thomas Trenchard, came by land. The Portuguese vessels were not content to sail only to China and to exchange its products for those of Europe, for in 1542 they appeared in Japan. Fernand Mendez Pinto, in his Travels, published in 1545, states that he and his companions were cordially received by the Prince of Japan. Evidently, then, at the time when Queen Elizabeth was reigning in England, the Portuguese were pushing their trade in the East as the Spaniards were in the West, and, As we have seen, the Portuguese, amongst other commodities, sent Oriental porcelain home, and brought European products back. They brought the Jesuits, too. Christian teachers had been at work in China for long years before the Jesuits came, but the activity and knowledge of these gave them great influence amongst the reigning class practically from the close of the 16th to the beginning of the 18th century. It is said that they had much to do with the evolution of the beautiful enamel colors of the next dynasty, the Tsing, though the evidence of this is of the slightest. On the contrary, the development appears to have had purely a native origin, an unusual step, it is true, to be taken by a nation which seemed all along the line to be reproducing earlier forms and earlier decoration. From the period when the vases of the Yongle period were in demand, painted as they were with lions rolling a ball, with birds, or with dark blue or red flowers, we find progress being continually made. Xuan Ti, whose reign is the most celebrated for the production of Ming porcelain, produced very fine examples, with flowers in pale blue, having red fish moulded as handles. Then comes the fine colour paintings of Tsinghua, through which we reach the perfection of the Kang He in the Tsing dynasty. It is remarkable that only a few Ming specimens seem to have been identified with enamel colour decoration, though in recent, indeed quite late times, authorities are ascribing many pieces with green and yellow enamel set in black outline to Ming rather than to Kang He. White, green, and crackle pieces are often mentioned in the historical records. We read that Lord Treasurer Burleigh, William Cecil, Secretary of State, for nearly 40 years to Queen Elizabeth, offered as a New Year's gift, in 1588, to his royal mistress, one porringer of white porcelain garnished with gold, and another gift of a similar kind was made to the Queen by Mr. Robert Cecil, a cup of green porcelain. Later we read that amongst the effects of Lady Dorothy Shirley were porcelain stuff, Chinese stuff, 24 porcelain dishes. It will be noted that it was only with the advent of Shakespeare and the authorized version of the Bible that our English spelling took anything like uniformity. The last note regarding Lady Shirley's possessions was made in 1620. In the time which had elapsed between these records much had occurred in the Orient. The Dutch, in 1595, sent out their first expedition to the East Indies, and Queen Elizabeth, not to be outdone, dispatched 3 English ships to China in 1596. 3 years later the East India Company was founded, a company which at first could not trade in India or China, owing to the fierce opposition of the Portuguese and Dutch. They therefore made their headquarters at Gombron, in the Persian Gulf. The China ware was brought overland or by coasting vessels to Gombron, which gave the early name Gombron ware to porcelain which was universally used before the adoption of the name China. During the Ming dynasty the practice of placing marks upon the porcelain was first adopted, though the rule seems to have been to mark only one piece in a set. Yet the method of marking porcelain was far from being universal or methodical. In acquiring Ming porcelain the buyer must be especially careful. For many centuries the old forms were copied, and in counterfeiting the porcelain and its decoration it was quite easy to imitate the mark. Here, then, we must once more advise the collector to rely upon sight and touch. We have stated that it is the inspiration of the educated eye regarding the tout ensemble which was largely to be trusted. On the other hand, it would not be well to dispense with the necessity for actually handling the piece with the view to detecting differences between the old and new work. In dealing with fine pieces there is one advantage. They are all submitted to expert after expert, whose opinions may vary, but truth is great and will prevail. The end of the Ming dynasty was rapidly approaching. The Tartars, with shaven head and pigtail, were as the storm clouds which had been collecting for some time, and at length they burst over the empire. The space of time between the years 1616 and 1644, when the struggle for supremacy between the Ming and Tsing dynasties was at its height, leaves the identification of porcelain made during that period a matter of considerable difficulty. In a national struggle, art manufacturers are the first to suffer, so that it is quite probable that only a small output of porcelain took place during these troublous years. In revising the Ming period, note should be made that the Hung Wu preferred black, blue, and white ornaments, and that gold used as decoration for a dark blue ground was first employed. In Yung Lo's time, intense patches of color were used, and there was a development with regard to the reds. A dark red was widely adopted. The paintings of flowers and of birds and beasts, mainly used figuratively as emblems, became far more delicate. The Tsinghua potters seem to have adopted a delicacy and a mastery over the art of porcelain decoration scarcely ever met with in history. It is true that the supply of blue failed, the cobalt was of an inferior quality, and the colored painting reached high perfection. The marks and designs of the Tsinghua period furnished unexampled opportunities for copying, for although the later Kang he showed, without doubt, the finest blue and white with regard to color that was ever made, the pattern generally adopted can be distinctly traced to Tsinghua. Kietzing was noted for the use of enamel colors of a beautiful depth and quality. About this time pure white cups were made imitating white jade, but the quality of the porcelain is inferior to many of the other periods because one of the sources of supply of porcelain earth failed. Chapter 7. The Tsing Dynasty, Kang he period, 1661 to 1722. Bearing in mind the struggle between the Mings and the Tartars, which lasted, as we have seen, from 1616 to 1644, we may take Shun Chi (1644 to 1661) as the first real Tsing emperor. Properly, the title of the dynasty, which has existed to our own times, would be the Manchu or Manchu, or Tse Tsing, or Ta Tsing dynasty, which is the 22nd imperial dynasty. The most distinguished emperor in connection with the manufacture of porcelain was the second, named Kang he, who had a long and peaceful reign from 1661 to 1722. In fact, he is the only emperor who reigned for a complete Chinese cycle of 60 years, and we shall find amongst our marks that the 61st year is distinguished by a cycle mark and not by the Nian Hao, or name mark. Note Figure 1 in the marks. Under Kang he's guidance, the porcelain manufacture received an immense impetus. Many improvements were adopted and new colors introduced, especially the enamel colors. Amongst the noted potters living long before his reign were two whose names have come down to us, although identification of their work is impossible. The famous Peng, as before noted, was an excellent potter, but he was only a copyist of old forms. Chao was a later potter who, near the end of the Ming dynasty, also excelled in imitating ancient vases. The work of these two old potters were copied at first by potters of the Kang he period. Franks says, "It is probably to this reign that we must refer most of the old specimens of Chinese porcelain that are to be seen in collections, even when they bear earlier dates." What generally were the qualifications and characteristics of the productions of the King Te Chin in this reign? Our illustrations, which should be read carefully, will give guidance to the careful student regarding the Chinese porcelain that was then produced. There seems to have been little doubt that the three colored pieces, decorated with yellow, green, and aubergine, were direct copies of the Ming products. Aubergine is a puzzling word and requires an explanation. It is a transparent enamel resembling the eggplant in the variation and gradation of its colors from gray to purple, or having various shades up to a rich brown. It will be found in the trees, stems, and branches, forming a principal part of the scheme of color decoration. The black family, famille noire, is of the same period. The black may be composed of other colors, but it is usually coated with transparent green enamel. Notice that there is a dull black, a mirror black, and this black covered with green enamel. Kang he black will receive due attention in the illustrations. It is rare and very valuable. Perhaps the first porcelain produced during the Kang he period was the green family, sometimes used with blue under the glaze. Wan Lai, the Ming emperor, is sometimes credited with introducing this green enamel. This, however, seems very improbable, for twice in his reign the Japanese invaded Korea, and the Tartars were always in rebellion. On the whole, the balance of evidence points to the green family as being a genuine product of the Kang he period. Another product of the same period was the green enamel used with blue enamel over the glaze, so that it is well to note that the fine greens which are classified as famille verte are usually ascribed to this period. The blue and white of the Kang he period has been noted before. The most lovely quality of this decoration must be always referred to this period. Whether we consider the cobalt blue as a color, as in the celebrated ginger jar with the prunus flowers, sold at Christie's for 5,900 guineas, or such pieces as we show in our illustration from Mr. Duveen's collection, worth £2,000 each, from 1720 right down to our own times this ware has been copied and ever recopied, but there is something in the blue used for decoration, something, too, in the quality of the white porcelain itself, and again something in the glaze, an intense brilliancy. These furnish a combination which has never been rivalled. The Kang he period was noted for a very rare biscuit Celadon, in which the surface of the panels in relief is unglazed, though the remainder of the decoration is blue under the glaze. Another fine quality of porcelain was that with archaic decoration having conventional flowers and bands in black and green. The marks of the Kang he period vary. In the earlier part of his reign the double blue circle and the Kang he Nian hao are frequent, but collectors must note that many specimens of this period have no date mark at all. If the two blue rings are used there are no letters inside. The reason of this is rather curious. In 1677 the superintendent of the works gave an order to the factories at King Ti Chin, in which he forbade the inscription of the Emperor's name or the characters which gave the history of their sacred great men. This order was given because it was thought that if the porcelain was broken it would be reflecting upon the honour of the Emperor or of the sanctified persons who were represented not alone by inscriptions but by paintings used in the decoration. However, this law did not remain in force for a very long period. When a piece is found with empty rings or with the symbol marks of the fungus leaf, etc., it can be assigned to a few years later than 1677. The importation to Europe had reached considerable dimensions before this. We read that in 1644 nearly 50,000 pieces of rare Japanese china were imported into Holland, and about 17,000 more of various kinds from Batavia by the Dutch East India Company. In this connection the rivalry between the Dutch and the Portuguese must be noted, because it affected the Oriental trade in porcelain very considerably. Stirred up by the Dutch, the Japanese, in 1640, excited by their fears of the ultimate designs of the Portuguese and the Spaniards, who had later appeared upon the scene, banished them in favour of the Dutch. Some thousands of Christian converts were massacred, and the Dutch were fully established at Nagasaki, where they laid the foundation of the progress towards Western civilization to which the world, and especially Japan, owes so much. Chapter 9. The Yung Ching Period, 1723 to 1736. The Yung Ching period, 1723 to 1736, though only 13 short years, was peculiarly noteworthy, because the Emperor himself took a personal interest in the imperial factories at King Ti Chin, and also in the head of the establishment, Hien Hsieh Yao, who, in 1727, was entrusted with the management. In porcelain much depends upon the potting, and in the actual potting the products of Yung Ching were far superior to any that had before appeared. The drawing, too, was in every way better. The colours, though not so brilliant, showed such care and taste in blending that even the fine famille verte suffers by comparison. As a rule the decoration was so applied that the porcelain could be admired, that is, the whole surface was not covered by the ornamentation. In some of the smaller pieces the result of this plan is beyond all praise. Only one thing suffered. The blue was far inferior to that of Kang he. We have already praised the quality of the cobalt applied as decoration to vases, ginger jars, etc., of the Kang he period. As if to balance this default the rose colour from gold was discovered, which gave birth to the rose family, famille rose. Other products which had their beginnings in this reign are worthy of notice. First there was a black decorated with colour, mainly with arabesques or curl work. The porcelain was of fine quality and the colour scheme so subdued as to be entirely pleasing to the eye. The black being relieved by pattern in faint green and further decorated in white, pale yellow, and aubergine of such an admirable character that one wonders why Yung Ching porcelain is not more appreciated. Still the rose decoration begun so successfully in this period, under the succeeding Emperor, received such attention as to place it in the front rank of Oriental porcelain. In fact we may say more. Collectors of the rose family care nothing for Ming with its greens and yellows, nothing for Kang he with its famille verte and black, but they esteem and value above all the famille rose, the Yung ching chef d'oeuvre, which we shall deal with later when we come to Keen lung. The pieces of the Yung ching period, decorated with blue under the glaze, with enamel in colour over the glaze, exhibited the same distinctive features which typical china of this period showed, that is, excellent potting and a skilful blending of the underglaze blue with the enamel colours over the glaze. There is this noteworthy distinction, too. The decoration of the backs of bowls and dishes is almost equal to that on the front. This is a helpful hint to which careful note should be given. Perhaps one of the most puzzling and at the same time interesting forms of decoration was the blue used in conjunction with peach bloom. These specimens were ornamented with combinations of 3 lines either long or bisected, called the pa kwa, the single mark forming a trigram, essentially male if the long lines were in the ascendant, and female when the half lines were most numerous. The later marks or symbolical devices will deal more fully with the pa kwa. Peach bloom was undoubtedly first introduced in the reign of Kang he, and the really valuable and fine examples belong to this period only. It is altogether a misleading term to those who are not experts, who expect to find the delicate pink of the peach blossom or flower. Peach bloom is nothing of this kind. Imagine a dark reddish brown of unusual but beautiful tone pierced through its surface in flecks of dark green and spots of pink, such as the flower would be when the first touch of spring coaxed it from the dark coloured sepal with flecks of green and a touch of pink. It is the colour of the bud when the peach begins to bloom, not the pink of the peach blossom so prettily tinted with yellow. Peach bloom and clair de lune are the 2 very finest self-colours which take precedence even of sang de boeuf. We shall have occasion to occur to this again in the chapter on self-colours. The next class is black with coral red under the glaze. In fact, 2 colours are found under the glaze in the Yung ching period, blue and red. The red is of a brilliant tone, not so striking as the red from gold, but still very lovely in combination with blue. Sometimes these 2 are used together with added enamel colours, but frequently in underglaze decoration that favourite ornament, the 5-clawed dragon in pursuit of the crystal ball or pearl, may be found. The circular device ball or pearl, showing the yang or the yin, signs for the male and female elements in nature, were at this period raised on the surface, and in overglaze enamels both the waves and the clouds were tinted with various shades of green and purple, and aubergine edged with black. We have already referred to the rose family, in which the enamel decoration was most carefully and artistically carried out in all its detail. The preponderating influence was a brilliant rose colour accompanied by green, yellow, and blue in all enamel colours, which were not less striking because still subordinate to the beautiful pink. When waves were used in the decoration they were of a charming sea green celadon enamel. The blue painted under the glaze has already been referred to as being inferior in quality, in colour and brilliance, to the products of Kang he. In fact, we must repeat that no blue and white was ever equal to the Kang he ginger jars and vases decorated with the prunus pattern, usually called the hawthorn, with the lip unglazed on the outside and partly glazed on the inside. Present day potters produce blue and white ginger jars, but the blue of Kang he is unapproachable, the paste is exquisite, and the glaze is incomparable. The Yung ching potters did well in blue and white, and the blues, though less brilliant, were very bright and pleasing. The distinctive feature of the period is that the borders of the vases were incised after the manner of the Ming blue and white, a pattern which appears at no other period. Let us try to explain this. About an inch from the top of the vases there is an incised pattern, a pattern cut in double incised lines, although forming a band about half an inch wide. A similar incised band is found round the base. Yung ching blue and white often has a decoration of rocks, waves, and curious conventional ground in blue of a carefully painted peach tree springing from the rocks, painted blossoms of a rich red tone with reddish or yellow-brown spots distributed over the white as if to emphasize the form of the decoration. The contrast between the delicacy of the detail is striking when compared with the broad treatment of the Kang he period. On the other hand there is fine stipple work. This is Yung ching. On the other hand there is a broad, bold wash of colour. This is Kang he. One of the most effective forms of decoration is what is widely known as powder or powdered blue, in which the cobalt is sprayed through gauze or dabbed either upon the whole surface or upon all of the surface except that by which mechanical means was reserved. Students of Oriental China will often come across the expression painted in reserves or compartments. By this is meant that the scheme of decoration of the whole surface has been so far modified that certain panels have been left in white for further decoration. Hence we get reserves of various shapes with varying decorations, powder blue vases with reserves decorated in blue, powder blue vases with reserves decorated in famille verte, and so on. The apparently granulated surface of powder blue is due to the colour having been blown through the fine gauze or dabbed on the whole portion that was not reserved. Celadon was brought to great perfection in this reign. Not only the various tints of green usually known by that name, and not only the brilliant white Celadon glaze with raised decoration in which a Celadon green is very effectively employed, but various glazes in which the colour, being applied in the glaze, was included in the same term Celadon. The decoration, often floral, was noted for its subdued tones of pink, mauve, red, and orange. Vases of the Ming Dynasty, especially the Suen Ti and the Chang Hua periods, were copied and recopied in every detail. Beautiful bowls were largely made with Celadon or coral grounds, with figures or other ornaments in coloured enamel. Sometimes reserves or compartments in white had special treatment of figure decoration. Other specimens imitated jade, or agate, or cornelian, or some other stone. The well-known pale green Celadon is the only one known to the trade by the name Celadon. Red or blue Celadons would be classified under self-colours. We have noted the green family, famille verte, of Kang he. The Yung Ching products of the same class differ from it in the quality of the colours used. The green enamel itself was much thinner and not so brilliant. It often had a blue shade, but it too was applied as an enamel in conjunction with the underglaze blue decoration. Instead of the reds from copper, the reds from iron were effectively used. A colouring like the red of rusty iron was used in several shades, ranging from an orange red to a bright orange, or even to a salmon pink. Other colours in soft tones were used, but a chief point to remember is that whilst the design is usually drawn in blue under the glaze, all the enamel colours were applied over the glaze, so that a blue tinge is conspicuous, and is a help to identification. A reference was made earlier to the rose family. This was a red from gold, and perhaps its highest development is seen in the brilliant ruby back plates of the Yung Ching and Qin Lung periods. This colour had its origin in the Yung Ching's short reign, and the shades of it vary from pink to purple. As enamel, the rose colour is most wonderfully applied to flowers, drapery, etc., and really it is far more decorative than the green, the powder blue, or indeed any other colour. It has their artistic merit, and the additional one of being a soft and most attractive tint. If green represents the leaves, rose pictures the flowers. And perhaps the most lovely combination is rose verte, where both of these are used in harmony. Chapter 10. The Qin Lung Period, 1736 to 1795. During the first 7 years of the reign of this emperor there was but little variation in the character of the porcelain manufacture at King Te Chin. In 1743, however, a new director was appointed to the works, Thang Ing, who continued the high quality of the manufacture of the 2 previous reigns, and brought the rose family to the most perfect state. Indeed, though the European influence exerted by the Jesuits may possibly have been more powerful than before, yet no European china quite reaches the glowing brilliance of these Chinese vases and dishes. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and Chelsea tried to copy the rose colour, the result being the fine claret colour of the Chelsea china. Sèvres came nearest with the rose de Bory, but, after all, the lover of old Oriental porcelain devotes all his energies to the acquisition of specimens made and decorated in the old times, imitations perhaps of very early Chinese products, but perfectly Chinese in instinct and impression. It is difficult, if not impossible, to separate Qin Lung china from Yung Ching in unmarked pieces before the full development of the rose famille. But the reign of Keen Lung was so much longer comparatively, and during the period the porcelain manufacture was so active, that it would be safe to ascribe the fine specimens of this rose family to it as well as to Yung ching, when the invention of the rose enamel took place. In the last reign we considered, but only shortly, this famille rose. The exquisite delicacy of these specimens lies in the combination of an elaborate but refined style of decoration, in which the painting was most artistic, with the graceful shapes of these pieces themselves. There are other types, bolder in colour, broader in execution, and, it may be, equally beautiful. Take, for example, a vase. Its body would be covered with large sprays of flowers in rose, yellow, and other enamels, but the rose predominates, and gives an effect which is very rich and striking. Chrysanthemums, peonies, irises or flags, anemones, pumpkin vines with flowers and fruit, all these were in common use with birds and butterflies, fishes and insects no less finely coloured, and, as it were, thrown up into relief by the use of black with that transparent green enamel which we have before described, and here and there a black spot is applied for the same purpose of enhancing the value of the coloured enamels. The porcelain body of the Keen Lung period is very fine and white, many of the specimens having a style of painting peculiar to the Chinese artists of this period. Flowers such as those we have mentioned, the chrysanthemum, peony, and rose, seem to be ribbed, as if when the enamel was not quite dry a tool was used for the purpose of breaking up the enamel, and in this way getting finer effects from reflected light. The porcelain itself sometimes assumed a wavy appearance, such as would be left by the potter's fingers when the piece was turned on the wheel. A similar wavy appearance is found on characteristic pieces on Bristol hard paste porcelain when turned upon the wheel. Amongst the rarest decorations of this class of porcelain in this period is what is called mille fleurs. In this class the whole surface is covered with 1,000 flowers in variety painted exquisitely in enamel colours of every conceivable hue. Yet though the colours are so varied, there is nothing but the most pleasing and harmonious effect. Pale lilac, reds, and yellows alternate with delicate shades of greys and blues. When the panels are left in reserves, a figure of decoration is freely applied to them, and the figures depicted represent the spirits of the flowers. On the bases, which are covered with pale sea green enamel, are found the square seal marks of Emperor Keen Lung. It is scarcely possible to have the privilege of seeing such perfect work of ceramic art, but the collection of the late Mr. W. G. Goulard, of Brunswick Terrace, Hove, was especially rich in mille fleurs pieces. The class allied to this, but probably later in date, is mille cerfs, that is, a decoration consisting of numberless deer ranging in a forest. The colour is not nearly as brilliant as in the mille fleurs class, though the same wavy porcelain is to be noted. The green, bluish in tone, like the greens of the Yung ching period, are harmonized with browns. In fact, the aubergines merge into sepia or brown. The hills are green and brown, with some hilltops in blue enamel. The birds are painted quite thinly in rather dull reds. This glaze could be fairly described as late famille verte. In this period the Celadons show considerable advance. Celadons were produced late in the Ming and early Kang he periods, and cover a range of tints which are difficult to describe, as we have seen in the case of peach bloom and clair de lune. The sang de boeuf is also difficult to describe, so that a pilgrimage should be made to any museum which has a genuine specimen. For instance, in the British Museum, Oriental section, in the centre of a large cabinet, there is a small bottle-shaped vase, which is a real sang de boeuf, a glaze of a brilliant colour shaded toward a deeper claret, and the base shading away into a pale yellow, pink towards the lip, which retains the soft, natural tone of the body or paste. Then just below, the neck of the sang de boeuf seems to glow with the intensity of the ruby, just before it falls from the shoulder of the piece towards the base. Other colours of this period are known as pigeon's blood and chicken's blood, crimson, crushed strawberry, and so on. To nearly all of these colours, the remarks which apply to the shading of the sang de boeuf can be noticed upon the specimens themselves. Here the glaze starts at the top of the vase or vessel. There is a yellowish tinge, and the colour has several gradations until it ends at the base. These reds originated in the late Ming period, reached high excellence under Kang he, and continued through Yung ching's reign, and under Keen Lung maintained their high perfection. The Keen Lung red Celadon has a somewhat blue shade when the light is reflected at an angle. It is well to remember that all those colors which are called Celadon, or self-colored, have the tints mixed in the glaze. Besides the reds, there are blues of many shades, violets, mauves, etc. In fact, any color that could be applied in a glaze was used as the sole decoration of fine porcelain. It is true that in many of the fine vases the body is molded with flowers or dragons or other patterns, yet the glaze was a whole glaze, and therefore Celadon. Notwithstanding this, the Celadon surface was itself frequently decorated by designs in enamel colors outlined in black. As we have before shown, it is easy to know whether a piece is decorated with Celadon or with enamel, because all enamel colors stand out from the glazed surface to which it is applied, and by passing the fingers over the decoration the enamel can be felt. This brings us to certain facts that must be remembered. Enamels, like Celadons, may be of any color. They are always burnt in, so as to amalgamate with the cover glaze, even if that cover glaze be itself colored and therefore Celadon. Also, there are but a few colors which can be applied before glazing, that is, upon the paste or body directly. We have seen that blue and red were so applied. This brings us to the other development. The Keen Lung class of blue and red under the glaze was derived from that discovered in the Yung Ching period. Its application was developed with surprising skill by the finest workmen, so that the application of copper red under the glaze, in combination with blue, gave splendid opportunities for these artists to display their preeminent skill for freehand drawing in applying designs upon the biscuit porcelain before the glazing took place. If, for example, you pass your hand over a piece decorated under the glaze, you will find a surface perfectly smooth, as the color has sunk into the paste. The next note is worth remembering, because it may be applied as a practical test to distinguish between the old and the modern blue under the glaze. This test of modern blue is to be found with the finest strokes, whereas in the old work each stroke is perfectly smooth or uniform in its outline, never labored, never hatched, but simple strokes which plainly follow the American plan of never taking 3 strokes when one will do. Most of the modern work reveals a tiny blue dot at the pull-off of the fine hair brush or pencil. The drawing and writing of the Chinese was always done by means of a pencil held perfectly upright by the fingers, so that by examination of the pencil marks it is quite easy to see whether the blue lines have inequality, especially at the point where the brush is removed, and our readers may detect forgeries of the old marks as well as the old drawings by noticing this blue dot at the end of the stroke. It is never found upon an old piece. The coral red family, which belongs peculiarly to this period, is extremely pleasing, and a very fine result is secured when used with blue under the glaze, leaving the design outlined in red, so that the red, white, and blue harmonize perfectly. But the coral red was also used under the glaze as a ground color. Then it was thickly powdered with white chrysanthemum leaves and flowers, and it had white reserves often decorated with sprays of conventional white lotus, chrysanthemums, and magnolia. The Chinese varied the colors in their decoration with wonderful effect. Blue under the glaze was, as we have seen, associated with reds under the glaze, but it was quite effective with enamels over the glaze, and we may take this as the next class of the period. The design, or any part of it, was applied to the paste. Then the piece was glazed and fired, so that on coming from the kiln it was simply a white porcelain piece, having red, or red and blue, decoration under the glaze. Then enamel colors were used to complete the design, such as green enamels with the blue designs showing through them, and thin dull reds under the glaze, as before noted, whilst the rest of the piece was coated with decoration in yellow, blue, or even white enamel colors. Perhaps the most, and here adjectives fail, charming, lovely, famous are words which arise in the mind. Ruby, pink, rose eggshell plates really should be seen rather than described. These all belong to the famille rose, but eggshell was not confined to this family. Dated specimens seem to indicate that the 2 earlier reigns had seen the origin and progress of this beautiful ruby porcelain, but there is no doubt that many of the finest marked pieces belong to the Keen Lung period, though Yung Ching produced excellent specimens. Let us give a few examples from the sale rooms. But first we could wish that all who will read this chapter could betake themselves to the Victoria and Albert Museum, to the British Museum, to Duveen's or Gore's in Bond Street, and see for themselves what Chinese eggshell plates really are. The Salting collection in the museum at South Kensington has very fine specimens, and the British Museum has similar specimens in 2 flat cases, which, unfortunately, do not allow the full value of the ruby back to be appreciated. At Duveen's there are 2 cases filled with the loveliest specimens, ranged before a looking glass, which enables the visitor to see both the design on the front of the plate and the lovely colour at the back. It is surprising, and yet not astonishing from the point of view of the collector who will have the best, to notice the prices which have been paid for these plates, which are quite small, ranging from 7 3/4 inches to 8 1/2 inches in diameter. A few examples will help in enabling us to estimate their value. One eggshell plate, enamelled with chrysanthemums and a sparrow, and with sprays of peonies round the border, on pink diaper pattern ground, 8 inches in diameter, sold at the sale of Louis Huth's collection for £105. The other pieces realized at the same sale are no less striking. Saucer dishes, pear, eggshell, with ruby backs, enamelled with branches of chrysanthemums and peonies on a white ground, 8 inches in diameter, sold for £80. But a better pair, enamelled with cocks and peonies in the centre on white ground, with pale green trellis border, 7 3/4 inches in diameter, realized £400. One saucer dish, enamelled with a pheasant, quail, and peonies in the centre, and a pale green marble border with pink prunus blossom, and 3 panels containing flowers, 8 inches in diameter, brought £135. The first and last of these were not pink backed, but they were certainly beautiful. Other eggshell plates at the same sale with ruby backs, which we shall describe shortly, even at the risk of appearing monotonous, were: one enamelled with ladies and children in the centre, diaper border, with 3 panels of flowers, 8 3/4 inches in diameter, which realized £150. Another enamelled with quails and chrysanthemums at the centre, with pink and green diaper borders and 3 panels of flowers, £155. Another enamelled with a lady and 2 children by a table, in a leaf-shaped panel, on gold ground, with border of various coloured diapers, 8 1/4 inches in diameter, £200. 2 saucer dishes enamelled with peonies and persimmon fruit in the centre, and shaped border of diaper ground, the border on green ground, with pale pink trellis edge, 7 5/8 inch in diameter, £310. A similar pair, but enamelled with ladies and children and vases in the centre, on a white ground, with pale green trellis pattern border and 3 panels of black, 7 3/4 inches in diameter, fetched the same price, £310. The gem of the whole collection was a plate finely enamelled with a group of ladies and children, vases and utensils in the centre, with 7 borders of various diapers and a small panel of flowers, 8 1/8 inch in diameter, £280. The plate with the 7 borders is the most famous of these eggshell ruby backed plates. The centre panel or reserve is leaf shaped, having in enamel colours, very delicately painted, a lady seated with 2 boys. Near her is a table on which are books, vases behind her and 2 vases on her left. This panel is surrounded by 6 diaper borders of various widths, of which the 2 chief are deep ruby, interrupted by 4 reserves in blue enamel, and the other a pale lilac, with 4 reserves enclosing flowers. Between reserves are 4 dragons in white. The diaper around the leaf is the 7th border. There are other diaper patterns in the 5 and 4 border plates, which have the leaf-shaped central panel, a decoration which is very similar. Some, however, of these eggshell plates have no diaper work, the sole decoration consisting of 2 cocks, beautifully enamelled, near rocks and foliage. Indeed, these birds are often found in plates with borders. Similar eggshell plates may have landscapes or flowers as the central decoration, with or without diaper borders. The name ruby back is given to these plates because the whole of the back, excepting the centre inside the rim, is enamel with a beautiful ruby tint. Indeed, we may say that these plates are amongst the finest creations of the Yung Ching and Keen Lung periods. To the eggshell china belong delicate mandarin vases which, probably, were made for exportation. Chapter 11. Mandarin Porcelain, Keen Lung Period, 1736 to 1795, and later. A mandarin is a Chinese official, either civil or military, but the word itself is not Chinese. It is a name given indiscriminately by foreigners to designate any Chinese official of whatever rank. The recognized official grades of Mandarin are 9, each distinguished by its dress. The so-called button on the hat, the Mandarin button, is conspicuous. It is really a very valuable jewel, and, like the rest of the dress, is worn under precise regulations. It will be interesting to notice how the Mandarin's rank is shown by the dress. The coats are always embroidered with gold, and were of coloured silk. In the first order, the button on the hat was a bead, and above that an oblong button of transparent ruby red, transparent red. The coat was violet, with a square plaque on the breast and back decorated in the civil class with a pelican, in the military class with a kylin, whilst the belt was ornamented with 4 agate stones set in rubies. In the second class the button was a red coral button resting on the ruby bead, red opaque. The coat had embroidered plaques decorated with a hen for the civil class, and a lion for the military class. The belt was ornamented with 4 embroidered plaques with rubies. The third class had a sapphire button, blue transparent. The coat had embroidered plaques decorated with peacock's plumes, each feather having only one eye. The symbolical peacock represented the civil class, and the panther the military class. The belt was ornamented with 4 plaques of worked gold. In the fourth class, an azure-coloured button of lapis lazuli, blue opaque, rested upon a small sapphire bead. The coat had embroidered plaques decorated with the crane for the civil and the tiger for the military mandarins. The belt was ornamented with 4 plaques and a silver button. The fifth class had a rock crystal button, white transparent, resting upon the small sapphire bead. The embroidered plaques were decorated with the white pheasant for the civil, and the bear as the symbolical emblems. The belt was similar to the last class. The sixth class had a button of white polished opalescent shell, white opaque, with a blue feather. On the embroidered plaques of the coat were the emblems of a stork for the civil and a little tiger for the military divisions. 4 tortoise-shell plaques and a silver button ornamented the belt. The seventh class had a button of plain gold, yellow brilliant, on a crystal bead. The embroidered coat had a partridge for the decoration of the civil division and a rhinoceros for the military. The belt was ornamented with 4 round silver plaques. The eighth class had 2 buttons, one upon the other, of worked gold, yellow opaque. The embroidered plaque of the coat bore the quail as the symbol of the civil division, and the stork as the symbol of the military division. The belt had 4 ram's head plaques and a silver button. The ninth or last class had the second button of worked silver, blank opaque. The embroidered coat showed the sparrow as the emblem of the civil mandarins, and the seahorse as the emblem of the military. 4 black horn plaques and a silver button decorated the belt. It will be seen that Chinese porcelain decorated with figures such as these, dressed in their robes, received the name of Mandarin China. The actual word comes from the Portuguese mandar, to command. Much could be said upon the subject of Chinese dress, as applied to porcelain in decoration, but it is only necessary to contrast the style of the Ming and Tartar dresses. The Ming long, flowing robes are held up with sashes, and the hair, turned up over the head, is either covered with a soft headdress or with the court ceremonial headdress. The Mandarin dress of the Tartar shows the robe principally, but there are besides the pantaloons and the high boots with thick soles. The hair is dressed in pigtail fashion, for from the earliest youth the Chinese children are shaved. The boys are shaved all over the head except at the top, and in the case of girls 2 tufts are left, one over each ear. These facts, while furnishing no actual clue to the age of Mandarin China, showed that at least it could not have been manufactured before the Tartars came into power in 1644. Probably the date of its manufacture is later. We can understand that these Tartars, who had enforced their own dress upon the conquered people, but who had at the same time adopted their religion, would continue copying the holy persons such as the 8 Immortals, the genii, etc., in the same dresses which had been used for hundreds of years. More than this, there seems to be a strong element of truth in the statement that the Mandarin decoration was due to the desire of the European traders to carry home porcelain which should illustrate the people, and the style and the colour of their clothes. If this is so, then the Yung Ching period would be the first in which Mandarin China was produced. At any rate, we do know that most of it was made in King Lung's reign, and that the potters of the later emperors to our own times have been manufacturing large quantities for commercial purposes. In Mandarin China the figures vary in boldness and in general character, but the colouring is of one class, pinks, reds, yellows, blues, and greens, so distinct in tone as to receive the name of Mandarin colours. The decoration of this kind of china includes boys and men at games, such as kite flying, warriors fighting, marching, or resting, men and children in masks, figures walking, riding on horses or on vehicles, lantern shows with scores of people, besides many other designs. This Mandarin decoration is associated with great varieties in the ground colours and patterns. Such are the swastika ground, the red ground, the blue ground mottled over the glaze, and the scroll ground. There are also many diaper patterns and a variety of borders of flowers, butterflies, dragons, sometimes in low relief, whilst often examples are met with in which vases are recessed so as to furnish a flat surface in which the decorative painting of figures, flowers, and birds lie flat in a shaped compartment or reserve, which may be joey shaped, leaf shaped, kakimono shaped, or makimono shaped. In studying the vases given as illustrations, these varieties of shaped panels should be noted, as they are constantly used in catalogue descriptions of the decoration. Amongst the most beautiful vases of this period are the conical shaped eggshell vases with short necks, covered with the most delicate scroll work in gilt, having large reserves decorated with Mandarin figures painted with the utmost delicacy, and the small reserves with rose and other flowers most carefully drawn. The question has been raised as to whether transfer printing as a mechanical process was ever applied to Oriental porcelain. In England, Dr. Wall, of Worcester, is said to have invented transfer printing as early as 1751, and Sadler and Green, of Liverpool, lay claim to the honour of its discovery at about the same time, whilst on the Continent a similar honour is claimed for the factory at Marieberg in 1760. There is no proof that any blue and white Oriental china, except during the most recent times, was ever decorated on a transfer printed ground. All of the blue and white Nanking and Canton ware was painted by hand under the glaze. When we consider the immense amount of labour necessary to keep up the supply of porcelain to Europe and also to the United States early in the 19th century, it is astonishing that no process work showing transfer printing can be discovered, although the invention must have spread to China before 1796, when King Lung died. We shall treat of blanc de Chine later, when we discuss the colours of Oriental china, but it must be remembered that most of the Chinese ware of this type was made during this period. Such were the statuettes of Kuan Yin and many other gods and goddesses. This cream white porcelain may date from any period even before Kang he. The earliest specimens are distinguished by being transparent, although thick, and by the creamy smoothness of their glaze. Some authors, however, ascribe the origin of this ware to the King Lung period. Chapter 12. Kia King, Tao Kwang, and the Later Emperors. Kia King, 1796 to 1821. When any country is disturbed by internal divisions or by external invasion, the inhabitants pay less and less devotion to art. The reign of this king was certainly disturbed. The people suffered from misrule, and though the traditions of the Chinese potters did still keep up, in a measure, the high standard of the previous reign, the neglect of the governing bodies, the emperor and court, took away much of their devotion to the development of the porcelain so conspicuous in King Lung's reign. The porcelain, however, remained good in the quality of its paste, and now and then it reached excellence with regard to the decoration, which became characterized by conventional designs. Coloured enamels and gold were largely used for ornamentation. The turquoise blue, famille rose, and a good blue-green were conspicuous. Mandarin china still continued to be made, though the modelling was comparatively clumsy and the paste thick, still, however, having the wavy surface always noticeable in Mandarin china, which was, as we have said, largely made for the European market. The influence of Western art made itself felt in the decoration. Many scenes were painted with European subjects, especially in the small reserves or vignettes. Some of the finest forms, too, of the early Sèvres and early Wedgwood and Adams styles were copied and decorated with festoons of raised husks, with a landscape in a medallion. This wavy porcelain seems to be specially connected with a comparatively thick blue enamel and a style of decoration usually called Lowestoft. Of course it is not Lowestoft. Lowestoft was a soft paste porcelain imitating early Bow and Worcester. The porcelain of the Keen Lung period, then, might be named the porcelain of commerce. European forms of pieces not used by the Chinese themselves are often found. The process seemed to have been something like this. The East India Company, all the captains and officers of the East India Company's ships, when visiting China, took with them orders for services to be decorated with crests or armorial bearings, with English landscapes, or with sporting or religious subjects. Blue and white was made in vast quantities, owing to the demand from Europe. It needs but one sentence of description. It was poor. About this time the Chinese potters copied the Japanese. Imari ware, with its flowers in conventional forms, various celadons in blue, lilac, grey-white on good fine porcelain, are traced to this reign. Perhaps it was most celebrated for the reproductions of the porcelain of earlier periods in which both pattern and mark were constantly recopied. Tao Kwang, 1821 to 1851. In this period there was a special development of the enameled rice bowl, although beautiful vases so decorated with enamel as to cover the whole surface were not uncommon. The use of 2 shades of green produces a very pleasing and comparatively new effect. Unfortunately, the Chinese potteries, as in the previous reign, seem to have devoted much of their time to reproductions. The rice bowls were often decorated in graviata, graffito, or scrovito patterns, in which the enamel was scratched with a point into a variety of twists and turns, forming beautiful variations from the ordinary plain enamel surface. This surface was also painted with flowers and figures. The process seems to have been first adopted by Keen Lung, and many pieces have the Keen Lung mark. In a set of 4 very fine examples which came under our notice, 3 had the Keen Lung mark, and the 4th that of Tao Kwang. In all probability the majority of them were made in the later reign, and the earlier mark was copied. The copying during this reign included all the older forms from the Kang He period, and it excelled in reproducing the famille verte and the famille rose. Perhaps the Yung Ching green enamel received the most special attention, for the outline of this design is often found first painted in blue under the glaze, so that the blue shows through the transparent surface enamels and gives a bluish tint to the decoration generally, which was quite the effect produced by a similar decoration in Yung Ching's reign. To the same class of rice bowls belong the pierced porcelains with patterns filled with glaze. Here the rice pattern is cut through the paste, while the paste was soft. Then, as usual, the blue decoration was applied, painted on by hand, and certain parts received a coating of white enamel before the whole was carefully glazed. The skilful glazing is shown by the evenness with which the pattern, in glaze, matches the general surface of the piece itself. The rice or star pattern is the most common of all these pierced porcelains. Some specimens have, however, a diaper pattern, and more rarely a dragon design with flowers and leaves, so cut that portions only are filled with glaze, which gives a very unusual and striking effect. These pierced specimens are not supposed to be earlier than the 18th century, and of course they may be very much later. Hin Feng, 1851 to 1862. Very little porcelain was made during this reign, owing to the Taiping rebellion, during which King Te Chin was destroyed. The first Chinese war with England took place in 1860. The rebellion ended in the next reign. Tung Chi, 1862 to 1875. With peace after the wars, the manufacture of porcelain was resumed. Generally, the best pieces were copied from the antique, though a pale turquoise ground with decoration of flowers and butterflies was made for exportation. Sepia drawings showed some distinction, but there was no new departure of importance. This period is modern, and these later emperors are only mentioned in order to bring the history up to date, and to call attention to the marks both on ordinary and seal character. Kuang Shui, 1875 to . In the present reign much more importance has been given to the improvement of porcelain, which is largely made for export, high prices being obtained for imitations which are sold as antiques. The largest customer is the United States of America. The intense conservatism of the Chinese has been largely broken down by the influence of outside pressure. The almighty dollar holds the field. Yet, if it is still true that For ways that are dark and tricks that are vain, the heathen Chinese is peculiar, he holds no monopoly of such qualities. Western civilization runs him close. On the other hand, the honour of a Chinese in trade is generally of a high standard, and the people have a natural instinct for artistic decoration, which has come to them as a legacy of ages past. And with this power they have, too, an unlimited supply of the very finest kaolin. Let us hope that happier times will bring back the glories of the past. End of Selections from Chats on Oriental China, by J. F. Blacker. Read by Marianne Spiegel.